When a 7-year-old girl approached Johnny Carson during a live Tonight Show taping, she was holding something that made his hands tremble. Whatever she whispered in his ear stopped the show cold. The audience froze, the band went silent. 30 million people watched as the king of late night struggled to speak, tears filling his eyes. No one understood what had just happened, but everyone knew they were witnessing something that was never supposed to happen on live television. It was November 14, 1985, at NBC Burbank Studios. Johnny Carson had hosted The Tonight Show for 23 years and never once lost control on air. But now his cue cards were shaking, his face pale, his voice gone. Standing before him was a little girl in a blue dress too big for her, wearing a man's wristwatch loose on her arm, clutching a folded piece of paper like it was sacred. Her name was Emily Warren. She was 7 years old, and 8 weeks earlier her father had died in a car accident. Michael Warren was a high school janitor from Pasadena and Johnny Carson's biggest fan. Every night he watched The Tonight Show with Emily on his lap, believing Johnny's laughter made life bearable. Winning front-row tickets had been his greatest dream. He never got to use them. Emily insisted they go anyway. "If we don't go, Daddy's dream dies," she told her mother. The night of the show, she wore her father's watch and carried a letter he had written months earlier. When Johnny stepped on stage and began his monologue, Emily didn't laugh, she waited. And when the moment came, she stood up and walked toward the stage. Security moved to stop her, but Johnny held up his hand. He knelt down to her level and asked her name. Emily told him her daddy loved him. When Johnny asked if her father was there, she shook her head and said he had died. Then she handed Johnny the letter and said, "Daddy said you would understand. He said you were the only one." Johnny unfolded the letter and began to read. At first, his expression stayed calm. Then his jaw tightened. His hands began to shake. Tears filled his eyes. The audience sat in total silence as Johnny Carson broke down on live television. The letter revealed that Michael Warren had been dying of cancer and that Johnny's show had saved him when he was a grieving child decades earlier. Michael wrote that laughter taught him how to survive pain, and that he wanted his daughter to learn the same thing. Johnny knelt again and held Emily's hands, telling her that her father understood what laughter truly meant. He gave her his pocket square and promised to remember her father every year. The audience rose in tears. Johnny kept that promise until he retired. Emily grew up to become a grief counselor, helping children who lost parents just like she did. She still wears her father's watch. And when Johnny Carson died, his widow wrote Emily to say he never forgot that night. Because sometimes love reaches us through strangers, and sometimes laughter is how we survive. That night didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Johnny asked that Emily and her mother be brought backstage. Away from the lights and the audience, he spoke to them quietly. No jokes, no performance. He told Karen that her husband was a hero. He told Emily that her father's words had reminded him why he had done this show for decades. And then he made a promise no one else heard. Johnny promised Emily that every year, on her birthday, he would think of her father when he stepped onto that stage. Not publicly, not for applause, just quietly, to himself. A private ritual between a man who made millions laugh and a janitor who believed laughter could save a broken child. It was the kind of promise Johnny Carson rarely made and never broke. For the audience at home, that silence became legendary. 30 seconds of dead air on live television, unheard of at the time. NBC switchboards lit up immediately. People weren't angry. They were crying. Parents held their children tighter that night. Viewers wrote letters saying they finally understood what Johnny Carson meant to them, not as a star, but as a constant presence in hard times. Years later, Emily would learn that Johnny kept her father's letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. Staff members noticed he became quieter after that night, more reflective. The jokes were still sharp, but the pauses lasted longer. Those who knew him well said something in Johnny had shifted, as if a stranger's pain had reached a place no applause ever could. Emily grew older, the watch finally fitting her wrist. She kept the pocket square framed on her wall, along with the letter and a signed photo Johnny had given her. When people asked why she chose to work with grieving children, she told them about a night when a man she never met taught her that pain doesn't disappear, but it can be survived. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, Emily wrote to his widow. She didn't expect a reply, but one arrived weeks later. Alexis Carson wrote that Johnny spoke often of the little girl in the blue dress and the letter that stopped his show. She said he believed that moment mattered more than any interview, any monologue, any rating. Today, Emily's own daughter is 7 years old. On her birthday, they sometimes watch old Tonight Show clips together. Not for the jokes, but for the reminder that love doesn't vanish when people do, that words can travel farther than time, and that sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the heaviest truth. For Johnny Carson, that night quietly followed him. Crew members later said he lingered longer before shows, staring at the audience as if imagining the lives behind the faces. He still delivered the jokes perfectly, but something human had slipped through the armor. A child's grief had reminded him that his work was never just entertainment. It was a lifeline for people he would never meet. In interviews years later, Johnny rarely spoke about emotional moments on air. But once, when asked why he respected his audience so deeply, he paused and said, "You never know what someone is carrying when they sit down to watch you." Those who knew the story understood exactly what he meant. He was thinking about a janitor from Pasadena and a daughter brave enough to finish his sentence. Emily's mother, Karen, said the change in her daughter didn't happen overnight. The grief didn't vanish. There were still nightmares and quiet mornings, but something had shifted. Emily believed her father's voice had been heard, that his life had mattered, that the love he carried had reached the man who made him smile through the worst moments of his own childhood. As Emily grew into adulthood, she learned that grief doesn't shrink with time. You grow around it. She chose counseling not because she was healed, but because she understood pain intimately. When children asked her how to survive losing a parent, she didn't give speeches. She told them that sadness and laughter can exist in the same breath, and neither cancels the other. Every year on November 14th, Emily pauses. She takes out the folded copy of her father's letter and reads it again, not because it hurts less, but because it reminds her of the night her father's love crossed a stage, silenced a nation, and proved that even ordinary lives can leave extraordinary echoes. The Tonight Show never acknowledged that moment officially. No reruns highlighted it. No anniversary specials replayed it. And that was exactly how Johnny wanted it. Some moments are not meant to be packaged or replayed. They are meant to be carried quietly, like a promise, like a letter folded carefully and kept close to the heart. And that is why the story still matters. Not because a show stopped, or a legend cried, or millions watched in silence. It matters because love spoke when laughter failed, because a child finished what her father started, and because one night proved that even the brightest spotlight cannot overpower the truth whispered softly at its center. Years later, people who worked on the show said that whenever a child appeared in the audience, Johnny paid closer attention. He asked producers quiet questions. He slowed down. That night had taught him something television never could. That sometimes the most important moment isn't the joke that lands, but the silence that follows when truth enters the room. Emily never saw the full tape until she was an adult. When she finally watched it, she didn't focus on Johnny crying. She focused on his hands shaking while holding her father's words. She realized then that grief doesn't belong only to the person who loses someone. It spreads. It connects strangers. It asks to be witnessed. Johnny Carson spent his career being the calm center of chaos. That night, he allowed himself to be human in front of millions, not because he chose to, but because love forced its way through. A letter written by a dying man, carried by a child, reached a place that no laughter ever could. Emily teaches her daughter now that memories don't fade when they're shared, that words matter. That saying something, even if it hurts, can change lives you'll never see. She tells her that her grandfather's voice traveled farther than he ever imagined, carried not by fame, but by honesty. And that's why this story endures. Not because Johnny Carson cried, not because television stopped, but because a father refused to let his love disappear with him. Because a child was brave enough to speak when adults could not. And because one whisper proved that even after we're gone, our words can still reach home. Long after that night, Johnny would tell close friends that fame had never prepared him for moments like that one. He could handle presidents, scandals, disasters. But a child speaking from loss stripped away every defense. It reminded him that the audience wasn't just numbers. It was people carrying quiet grief into dark rooms, hoping laughter might help them breathe. Emily grew up knowing her father through stories, photographs, and that letter. But she also knew him through the way Johnny had listened, through the way a stranger honored his words without ever meeting him. It taught her that being remembered isn't about status. It's about impact, about how deeply your life touches even one other soul. In counseling sessions years later, Emily would sometimes tell children that grief doesn't mean something is broken forever. It means love had nowhere else to go. She told them about a night when love crossed a stage, stopped a show, and reminded the world that pain and meaning often arrive together. The Tonight Show continued, jokes landed. Ratings held strong, but that silence lived on beneath the laughter. A quiet reminder that even the most polished performances sit on fragile ground. That behind every smile on television is a human being who can still be undone by a single honest moment. And perhaps that is the real reason the story still resonates. Because we all carry letters we haven't handed over yet. Words we hope someone will hear for us if we can't say them ourselves. And sometimes, all it takes is one brave voice to deliver them. That night proved something simple and devastating. That love doesn't need a microphone. It doesn't need applause. It only needs someone willing to listen. And when it finally finds that listener, even legends can fall silent. After that night, Johnny Carson never spoke publicly about the letter again. No interviews, no memoirs, no behind-the-scenes stories. But people who worked closely with him noticed small changes. He lingered longer during commercial breaks. He asked producers about audience members. He stopped assuming laughter was enough and started treating it like something fragile that needed care. One producer later said that Johnny began reminding the staff of something before tapings. "You don't know who's out there tonight," he would say. "Someone might be watching because this is the only thing keeping them going." It wasn't a joke. It wasn't said for effect. It was said with quiet seriousness, shaped by one letter and a child brave enough to deliver it. Emily and her mother returned home after the show changed forever. Grief did not disappear. Nights were still long. Mornings still heavy. But Emily had something new now. Proof that her father's voice had been heard. Proof that his love had landed somewhere meaningful. It gave her something grief alone never could. A sense that loss had not erased him. At school, Emily didn't talk about that night. She didn't tell classmates she had stopped a television show. She didn't talk about Johnny Carson crying. What stayed with her was simpler, that adults can listen, that strangers can care, that even when someone is gone, their words can still move through the world and matter. Years later, Emily would learn how rare that moment truly was. Live television does not pause. Legends do not break. Silence is not allowed. And yet everything stopped because one man chose to listen instead of move on. Because one host allowed himself to be human instead of professional. That decision mattered as much as the letter itself. Johnny Carson carried that understanding quietly into the final years of his career. He never changed his style. He never became sentimental on air, but he respected silence more. He allowed moments to breathe. He stopped rushing past emotion. Those close to him believed he understood something new. That laughter is powerful, but only when it honors pain instead of covering it. When Johnny retired in 1992, he spoke about comedy, timing, and gratitude. But those closest to him said the real goodbye happened years earlier. on a night when he knelt on a stage and held a child's hands, when he learned that his work had become part of someone else's survival story. That knowledge stayed with him long after applause faded. Emily grew into adulthood carrying grief like a quiet companion, not something that disappeared, but something that softened with time. She chose to help children because she knew what it felt like to be small and overwhelmed by loss. She knew how much it mattered when someone stopped and listened instead of turning away. In her office, children sometimes ask her if the pain ever fully goes away. Emily tells them the truth, that it doesn't, but it changes. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that crushes you. She tells them that laughter does not erase sadness. It walks beside it, just like her father hoped it would. Every year on November 14th, Emily takes a moment alone. She reads her father's letter again, not because it hurts less, but because it reminds her that love leaves marks, that words matter, that even ordinary people can leave extraordinary echoes when they speak honestly from the heart. When Johnny Carson passed away, the news reached Emily quietly. She sat with it for a long time, not mourning a celebrity, but honoring someone who had listened when it mattered most, someone who had treated her father's pain with dignity, someone who understood that sometimes the greatest role you play is simply being present. Emily later learned that Johnny kept very few personal items from his career, but he kept the memory of that night. Friends said he mentioned it rarely, but when he did, his voice softened. He would say that it reminded him why he chose comedy in the first place. Not for fame, but to reach people he would never meet. Today, Emily's daughter asks questions about her grandfather, about the watch, about the letter, about the night that stopped a television show. Emily tells her that love can travel through time, that even when someone leaves, their voice can still find a way forward if someone is willing to carry it. The Tonight Show continued for decades after Johnny Carson. Hosts changed, audiences changed, television changed. But moments like that night remain rare, not because they are dramatic, but because they are honest, because they cannot be planned. They arrive only when someone chooses courage over comfort. That is why this story endures, because it is not about fame or television history. It is about a father who wanted his daughter to know she was loved, a child who refused to let that love disappear, and a man who listened when silence was the only right response. We often think impact requires greatness, but sometimes it requires only truth, a letter written in quiet hope, a child brave enough to speak, and someone willing to stop everything and listen. That is how lives change, not loudly, but deeply. And if this story lingers, it is because it asks something of us, to listen more carefully, to honor the weight people carry quietly, to remember that even in our darkest nights, words still matter, love still reaches, and sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the greatest truth.